Well, welcome back. In yesterday's session, I began talking about Peter and giving a little kind of a autobiographical sketch of him. And as I said, I find him to be really one of the more interesting characters in all of the Bible, and certainly within the New Testament. We know very little about the Apostle Paul before his conversion, but we know a great deal about Peter and his lifestyle. As I said, that he lived in the city of Bethsaida, which was just a few miles from Capernaum, and it was connected to the city by a channel of water that used to reach all the way back to the foothills of the mountains of Galilee in those days, and the mountains of Bashan in those days. And the thing's really fascinating to me is that Peter lived in this really what would be considered a middle-class neighborhood. They had a stable income, unlike farmers and others who had to live subject to the vagaries of the weather. They were people who were employed year-round in a very productive industry. We know that the fishing industry was very productive, and they used to make this stuff called garum, which is kind of like a condiment that they made from basically putrefying fish parts, and sold it all over the world. And so it was considered to be a real delicacy. We know that Herod even ate garum as a condiment that he put on his food to give it additional seasoning. So there were many ways, as well as not just fresh fish, but also fish that were dried, they were salted, and they were sold. In fact, there's one traditional account that John the Apostle, that his family sold dried fish, salted fish, to the house of the high priest, and that's how he gained access into the palace of the high priest when Jesus was arrested. So what I want to really kind of convey is that when we look at Peter, we need to think of him as not some guy who was just eking out a living, but things were good. I mean, they owned a few different ships. They had an industry going. He was a very successful small businessman. And that's why when we think about the call of Peter, when Jesus sees him on the Sea of Galilee and says, "I'll make you fishers of men, come and follow me," that didn't happen overnight. In fact, when we really break down the chronology of Jesus' ministry from basically his baptism by John to his temptation in the wilderness, and then returning not to Nazareth, but going on up to Capernaum and making Capernaum the center of his ministry for most of the 3.5 years, that when we understand that whole context, we realize that he had been in Capernaum about 6 months. In other words, Jesus was regularly teaching and ministering to Capernaum because there were large crowds of people who would be traveling as traders and merchants, but also as people heard about the miracles of Jesus, they were coming to hear what he had to say, and they were coming to be healed and receive some kind of personal blessing or miracle. So when you recognize this, that Peter's a guy who is sitting out there kind of in the congregation, he's in the pew, he's observing all these things that were taking place, he was listening to Jesus, and he was clearly impacted by him. And that's why when Jesus comes to the shore and says to Peter, "Have you caught any fish?" And Peter says, "No." I mean, this would have been a common question that people would have asked fishermen that day. And he says, "Well, go out, launch your boat again, stop cleaning your nets and putting things away for the day. Pick everything up, put it back in your boat, go out, and cast your net on the other side." And the thing that's so amazing is that Peter says, basically explains, "I'm the fisherman, you're the preacher, but I'll do it if you tell me to." And apparently Jesus made it clear that he wanted to do it. And he ends up having a huge catch of fish at a time of day when that was not likely, in a place where that was not likely. And he brings this forward, and his first recognition is that I'm a sinner, and Lord, I don't deserve to be in your presence. That's the only way any of us can truly approach Christ in an effective conversion way, that we recognize that we are not worthy to be his followers. And so when Jesus says to him in that moment, this really significant moment, he says, "Follow me and I will make you a fisher of men." This is something that is very profound, not only in its connection to Peter on a personal level, but also what he had to give up. We have to remember that Paul later on makes reference to Peter's family. So he had a wife, he very likely had children, he had a home, he had a business, he had an enterprise that was doing very well, and Jesus chose him and said, "Follow me." And the same thing would have been true of Andrew, certainly was true of John and James as well. And so these men were walking away from what would have been considered a very successful life to follow Jesus on one of uncertain future. And I really, really love that about them, because what we find in them is this response that oftentimes I remember over the years, I'd had people come to me and say, well, I haven't been able to find a job. I haven't been successful in anything else. I wonder if God is calling me into the ministry. And the kind of mindset is, if you fail at everything you do, then you should go into the ministry. And yet I find oftentimes that Jesus calls people who are really in that sweet spot of their life where things are going really well, and they've chosen to follow him because they can't live with themselves if they don't. It was Charles Spurgeon who said that, how do you know whether a person is called to the ministry? And he says, if you can be happy doing anything else besides being in pastoral ministry, then go and do it. But if not, it's very possible that you're being called by God. And so what I call it is kind of a holy discontent that grows up in the inside of us, where we really feel like, I'm missing the central purpose of my life if I don't begin to follow the path that Christ has for me. And certainly that was something Peter did. When Peter makes a statement later on, he says, Lord, we've left everything to follow you. He wasn't talking about a few small, insignificant things. He was talking about an entire career, entire lifestyle, a whole way of living that was enviable by many people. And he said, we walked away from that to follow you. And basically now we're not going to stop following you at this point. So this is one of the things I love about Peter. He's one of those guys that he's relentless. And he had to learn not to be ruthless, but he was relentless. There's a lot of powerful people who are both relentless and ruthless, but he was relentless. Once he committed to something, he stayed with it. And that's why his failure when Jesus is arrested and his denial strikes you so significantly, because we kind of realize that Peter had taken some pride in the fact that he was as hard as a rock. And sometimes he could be as dumb as a rock as well, but nonetheless, he was somebody who was intent and focused, and we would almost say maybe loyal to a fault. But I think it's beautiful, nonetheless, when you look at his life and you look at the commitment he made, you look at the service he gave, that this is a man who, once he decided to follow Jesus, this was something he sincerely was committed to doing. And yet, he is a guy who is rebuked by Jesus more than anybody else, and in some pretty harsh ways. I mean, he has the notable characteristic of being referred to as being Satan by Jesus because he spoke out of his human interest and desire. Because part of the ambition that really troubled all of the followers of Jesus is that when they became to realize that he was a Messiah, in their mind, the Messiah was a ruling conqueror. Not only would he defeat all of their enemies, but he would rule over the world. And as a consequence, they saw themselves being on this inner circle, and they were hitching their post to his star, and they wanted to rise with him. And that's why, in part, why his death on the cross was so devastating to them, because all of their hopes and dreams and aspirations from a worldly perspective had completely become wiped out. And I would just simply say that this is not unusual even today, because I think oftentimes those of us who are called to full-time ministries, that many times we can begin to get bit with a bit of ambition. When we begin to experience a little bit of a success and people begin to give you a little bit of fame and recognition and tell you how great you are and how wonderful you are, it's really easy when people flatter you like that you can suck it in. And as someone once put, that flattery will not hurt you unless you suck it in, and then you'll find it's a toxic gas that will kill you. And so it's really not surprising that Peter would get caught up in all of this and become recognized, because ultimately, up until the Last Supper, Peter was clearly the number one guy on the team. That's why the Last Supper in that regard was very significant for Peter, because when Jesus seated the apostles around that table, the first seat was a seat for the guest of honor. The second seat was the host. The next seat was a person who was responsible for, caring for everything. And Peter is all the way on the other end. He's the last one at the table. It's almost like publicly Jesus demoted him. And then Peter goes on from there, and he fails miserably by denying the Lord. You can see how that by the time we get to the end of the Gospel of John, Peter pretty much feels like he's a total failure. He's blown it completely. And one of the things I've learned over the years, it's become kind of a little motto for me, is that whatever humbles me helps me. Whatever humbles me helps me, and whatever hurts me heals me. In other words, God is going to allow humbling things to come into your life. And you have to understand that we need to be humbled. because it's in our weakness that we discover his strength. We gain access to his power. And secondly, things that hurt us oftentimes are the very things that bring healing, because when we're hurt, we become open to really looking at some issues in our life that allowed us to be so easily hurt. And oftentimes the being hurt part is pride. So these are things I think that as I look at Peter's life always become exciting to me, because I realize I see myself more in Peter than I do in a lot of the characters in the scriptures, certainly more than John, who, as I said yesterday, was kind of a total empath, I think. But we'll continue on as we look at this opening verses here and talk a little bit more about who was this letter being written to? Who are the recipients? Look forward to it and see you tomorrow.